Welcome back to video number 2 in the year-round baby cardigan tutorial hosted by B.Hooked Knitting and sponsored by Red Heart Yarns. What we're going to cover in this video is the ribbed edging. We're going to sew everything together and we're just going to put all the finishing touches on our baby cardigan. So back in video 1 we knit most of the entire pattern. Here the biggest part we have to knit is the sleeves and just a couple of extras. So you'll want to grab your sweater, grab your pattern, and let's get started. So we're now moving into the final stages of our sweater here in the second video. And what we completed in the first video is what you see here. We have basically the full body of our sweater and we just have a few finishing touches to finish things up. What we're going to cover in this video is we're going to work the sleeves. So I'll show you how to pick up and knit the sleeves. And then we have just some banding to do. So we'll have our neck band and then we'll have our button band here. Let's go ahead and get started on that now. We're going to begin by first sewing up these two little sections right here so it makes it easier for us to pick up on the arms to knit those. So I'm just going to demonstrate one way that I like to sew together two bind off edges, which is what we have here, so that you have a nice clean join just like you see here. You'll need to orient your sweater so that your right side is facing out and you'll flip it around just like that. Line up your two edges so that they are as close as possible. And thread your darning needle. This is just my bind off tail. If you don't have one, you can always just add on a piece of yarn and you'll just go directly under the stitch that's right across. I typically like to just fold it out like this so I can see. And then you'll locate the next stitch. Now I'm not really going under the entire V. Now if I were going under the V, it would look a little bit like this. But I'm actually going under the little loop on the side of both sides. And you'll just do that for each stitch until you get to the end. Once you have both of your shoulders seamed up, then we're just going to grab our knitting needles and our yarn and we're going to start picking up and knitting for the sleeves. If you were using straight needles for the rest of your knitting here for the body, you're definitely going to need either circular needles like I have here or double pointed needles. Because we have to go around this little section, you know, it's curved quite a bit and you just absolutely can't make it work on straight needles. I honestly have a little bit of trouble for the first few rows with the circular needles. So that's something to keep in mind. Grab those tools and your yarn and let's see how to pick up and knit the sleeves. First, just choose the side that you want to work on and get it situated so that the sweater is kind of open. And it's very important that the right side is facing up. Okay, that's going to make a big difference in how these stitches are picked up. If you pick up from the wrong side, then it's going to curl the work outside and then it'll look like the seam is pointed on the outside of the sweater. So when we pick up and knit from the right side facing, it's going to tuck these little edges in and then we're just going to be left with a nice clean seam or what looks to be a seam. So you'll simply grab your yarn. The first thing that you'll need to do is look up in your pattern how many stitches you need to pick up and knit. It's dependent on the size, so I'm going to pick up and knit 45 stitches for the size that I'm working on here. And the other thing you'll need to do is just do a little bit of counting and planning before you start out. I typically like to pick up and knit in between the little garter stitch ridges. So we have a ridge here and a ridge here. I like to pick up and knit in between. And I'll demonstrate that, but first I just need to do a little bit of planning. So I'm going to count. I have an edge here, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. So that should work out pretty well. So 21 on this side, 21 on that side is going to give me 42 stitches. And then if I pick up and knit about 3 in between, then I should end up with my 45. Just taking a couple of minutes to plan like this really goes a long way. If you just start picking up and knitting at random, you might have too many stitches or too few. And honestly, it's not a huge deal, but if you want to follow the rest of the pattern for the sleeve with ease, then you're going to need to be on the same stitch count as what they are in the pattern. Okay, so once you have that figured out, then I'm going to just insert my needle in the first place that I want to pick up and knit. And like I said, it's just right there in between those 2 garter stitch rows, the ridges. And I'm just looping my yarn around. So just like we were picking up our stitches on the little back section there, I'm just going to loop that around my needle and then just work it through. Now this is where I find it's a lot easier for me to pick up and knit with the yarn in my dominant hand here. I guess this is why I'm a little bit, I can work with both my right and my left hand as far as holding the working yarn. So this really comes in handy for me. If you're having problems just holding on to the yarn with your dominant hand, if you're used to using your non-dominant hand, then, you can just put the needle through the stitch, pick up the yarn just by itself and wrap it around. Anyway, so you will find your next opening to that ridge, wrap your yarn, and pull that through. Now when I am going into the ridge, I'm finding the V from the knit on this right side here. So you can kind of see there is a little V right there. That's where I'm inserting my needle. And I don't think it matters too much where you place it. Obviously you want to keep it as close to the edge as possible to keep a clean join. The main thing is that you want to keep it consistent from one stitch to the next, because if you're jumping back and forth, like if you work, far on the edge and then in here you jump in, then you're not going to have a clean join. So I just like to spread out the work so I can kind of see what I'm doing, find that little V and just put my needle in there, wrap the yarn and pull it through. And of course you'll just want to keep count as you go all the way up this side. So now I have picked up all of the stitches along the front of the cardigan. I'm coming over that join, and just by my counts, I knew I needed to add about 3 stitches here, so I'm just going to work on that now. And then I'm going to work down the back of the cardigan. And you're probably already feeling a little bit of discomfort here. I have 4-inch circulars, so even just the 4-inch it gets a little bit tricky. Once you get your sweater on the cord here, obviously you have some flexibility and it'll be a little bit easier, but just know that things are going to get a little bit uncomfortable for the next few rows, and that's completely normal, but it will improve. What I would recommend really is just taking your time at this point, getting under some really good lighting so you can make sure that you're picking up the stitches in the same place, in a consistent place for every single stitch that you have. Now here I have all of my stitches worked onto my circulars, and we're going to continue working in rows. So you would think it would be a lot easier to work this in the round, but that's not what the pattern tells us to do. We're going to work in rows, and we're going to do so for 7 rows specifically, and that is no matter which size of the pattern you're working on. You're going to work evenly in garter stitch for 7 rows. So that's what I need you to do at this point. Our first row is of course going to be in this direction here, and working evenly in garter stitch for 7 rows. So just knit every stitch for 7 rows. And your first row here is going to be a lot more difficult because when we pick up and knit stitches, it's really easy for us to have tight loops, tight stitches on our needle. And so that's typically the case. It's like that for mine too. So just work through it and finish up 7 rows of garter stitch. Okay, so what I've done here is I have knit my 7 rows even in garter stitch, so I just knit every single row. And I wanted to talk about a couple things that I didn't point out earlier. First thing is a row counter. If you haven't already picked up one of these, I highly recommend you do it, especially for the sleeves. It gets a little bit difficult to count the garter stitch rows, and we're going to be decreasing every 8th row. So again, it's just so much easier if you can have one of these row counters. You can just place it on your thumb like I have here, and they're less than $10 on Amazon, so it's definitely a good investment. Another thing that I didn't mention before is that this open edge here, we're leaving that open. And we're doing that for a reason, because as we knit up the sleeves a little bit more, when we go to stitch this thing together, we're going to stitch these little edges right here. So that's just something to keep in mind that I did not point out earlier, is when you do pick up and knit those stitches, you're just picking up from the edge here to the edge on the back side, and we're leaving those bound off stitches alone. We're not doing anything with those now. Okay, so now that we have our 7 rows worked evenly in garter stitch, we're going to start decreasing just a little bit. It's a really slight decrease, and as I mentioned, it is every 8th row that we're going to be decreasing. Now, trying to get my cord situated here. On the decrease row, so what I do, since I have this stitch counter and this row counter, is that every time I hit a multiple of 8, I know that that has to be a decreasing round for this pattern. So right now I have finished 7 rows, so that's what the 7 is displaying. So I'm working on the 8th row, and since that is a multiple of 8, I know that I'm going to have to decrease. Now we'll cover this decreasing row, and then I will set you free because it is a rather long repeat depending on the size that you're creating. And so the first stitch you want to knit. And then we're going to knit 2 together. So we'll just find those next 2 stitches and insert your needle into both of them knitwise. There we go. Now you'll notice that I picked up my dominant hand for that decrease, and that's just what I personally like to do. I have a hard time knitting 2 together in the continental knitting style where I'm holding it with my left hand. So I will typically switch back and forth. And now we are going to knit the row until we have 3 stitches remaining. Now when you have 3 stitches remaining to be worked, then we're going to decrease again. So we will knit 2 together. And then we'll knit the last stitch. So then from there, I'm just going to add one more to my row counter, saying that I've completed 8 rows. And now we're just going to work that repeat. We're going to knit evenly and garter stitch for 7 rows. And then we're going to do that decreasing row just like I demonstrated here on that 8th row. So you'll repeat that as much as the pattern tells you to. It's going to tell you a specific number of times based on the size that you're creating. Now go ahead and complete that. I will show you how to do the ribbed edging once we get to the bottom of our sleeve, and then we'll move on to our neckband. Alright, so what I have done off camera here is I have knit my entire decreasing section of my first sleeve, and I went to rows 56. Now that's for the size that I'm making, the 12-month size. And again, your written instructions will tell you exactly how many of those repeats you need to make where you're decreasing. Well, once you get to that point and you're finished decreasing, we're going to knit evenly and garter stitch until our sleeve measures a certain amount. I'm targeting 7 inches for the size that I'm making. And so when we knit evenly and garter stitch, just to review once more, we're going to knit every single stitch for every single row until our sleeve measures that target measurement, which like I said for me is 7 inches. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Then we have just a few more rows to complete our little ribbed band, and we can move on to our next section. When your sleeve measures the proper length as indicated by the pattern, then the last thing that we need to do is make just a little ribbed edging. And we're doing that the same way that we did here at the beginning of the body. So if you remember back to that 1x1 rib, the way we're going to do that is alternate knits and purls. So we will start by knitting the first stitch and purling the next. Knit the next stitch and purl. And we're going to repeat this until we get to the other side, and we'll repeat that for a few rows. Now, I mentioned in that first video that you should pay attention to the number of rows that you do your ribbing down here at the bottom. I did 3 rows of ribbing, and you'll just want to repeat that the same number of rows. That way everything matches and is consistent from band to band. So go ahead and finish your band, your little ribbed band, until it measures approximately a 1/2 inch or so, or the same number of rows that you worked for the body. And then I will show you the bind off for the 1x1 rib, which is a little bit different than what we have done with just our regular knit stitches. This is what it looks like after a few rows of working in that 1x1 ribbing, and once it measures the proper length and you're ready to bind off, then the technique isn't that much different, but you just have to be mindful of your stitches. Now we talked about before how to see which stitch is a knit and which is a purl. So the knits typically look like V's and the purls have the little bumps next to them. So there's a V there and a bump there and a V there and a bump there. Just be mindful of that as you're working your first few stitches. So we can see that my first stitch here should be a purl. So even as I am binding off, I'm going to maintain my stitch pattern. So I have my purl there. And the next stitch is a knit. So I'm going to knit that stitch. And now I can pass this first one over to bind off. So we're still going to have 2 stitches that we've taken care of and then bind one off, and we're still going to work the next stitch, but instead of just always working in knits like we're going to keep it in our stitch pattern. So the next one I see here is a purl. So I'm just going to purl, and then I can pass it over to bind off. Now the next one is a knit, so I can knit and pass it over to bind off. So that's the pattern. That's what you'll need to do just for this last little section of the sleeve. And once you've finished your bind off and you're ready to trim things up, I recommend that you leave yourself a tail that's at least 12 to 15 inches. We're going to use that to sew the 2 ends together. So just leave yourself a long tail and then pull the tail through the loop. Now I do want to quickly demonstrate just how to sew up the seam, just because honestly this was the part that I struggle with the most, especially when I was learning, was making my seams neat and clean. And honestly, I mean, there's probably still room for improvement, but I do want to give you just a couple of tips that I have found will create a neater join rather than just to whip stitch or something like that. So as you can see, I just took my tail and I joined the 2 pieces together just right down at the bottom. Now the placement of the stitching is going to be a little bit different right here because we have our ribbing and the stitch pattern is different. So what I recommend is poking around in the middle of the stitch. And when you do that, you can see this little bar in between. And you just want to pull up on that. Then you'll jump over here and find that same bar on the next stitch. And pull that through. And you're just going to go back and forth, kind of like you're lacing shoelaces. And once you get a few stitches, when you pull on it, it's going to pull that tight and it's going to pull the pattern together. Now once you get into the garter stitch section, it's not going to differ that much. You're going to still find the little V from the knit stitch. So you can see my V right here, just barely. You'll place your darning needle under that, just in between, and that's where you'll find that bar. So you'll pull that, and then you'll just jump over to the other side. You'll find your V until you find that bar. Then you'll go up to the next stitch. Until we get to that top section. Then we're going to stitch it here, and so I will demonstrate that next. Once you've worked your seam all the way up until you just can't seam it up anymore from side to side, then we can start joining with our bind off edge here. And we'll just work that pretty similarly. I'm going to grab the bar in between and try and work that into a stitch that's right across from it. Once you get that completed, then you can see I've just worked my tails here on the inside. Once I get finished with everything, I'm going to go back and weave in all of these ends. I'll do a real quick demonstration on that as well. But now we're ready to move on to the neckband. This actually works up really fast. We're going to be working in this 1x1 rib like we did here, and we're going to pick up and knit just like we did before. So you're going to need your circular needles or DPNs, your double pointed needles if you don't have a circular. And my best piece of advice is to stay as close to the stitch count that's recommended in the pattern. Do that as close as possible. But if you find yourself not coming up with the same number that's within the pattern, that's actually okay for the neckband. What we need to do is keep it in an odd number and just get it as close to that number as possible. So here we have something that's a little bit different. We have a bind off edge where we're going to start. So I'm just going to insert my needle as close to that corner as possible. And then grab your yarn, just fold it in half, place that on your needle, and pull it through. You might find it a little bit easier to work actually in between the stitches, to get your needle in between rather than to get it under the V. It's actually a lot harder that way. So I'm just going to go in between those next two stitches. Pull that through. And I'm working this so that the right side is facing up again. So you can see that this edge here is now going to be hidden. It's going to be on the inside of the sweater. Now as you come to this little step part here, so where we did our shaping a little bit, you want to make sure that you have these little pieces folding inward, and so it's going to create more of a natural curve to it. You're just going to continue picking up stitches. What I find works best for me is if I pick up a stitch for every, like in between every single one of the garter stitch ridges, just like we did back when we were picking up for the sleeve. I think it looks much neater if we can pick up a stitch in between every one of the garter stitch ridges, now that we're working on the side of garter stitch rather than working on a bind off edge. Now, as I said before, as long as you're consistent with this, there's really no right or wrong way when you're picking up and knitting. It's just whatever looks best. So if you're picking up and knitting and you see that, maybe there's a little bit of a gap or a hole there, just pull back until you get to that spot and rework it. Maybe put a stitch where that gap is. And as long as you're consistent in how you're working the stitches on this side versus this side when we get around to it, then you're going to end up with a nice looking collar pretty much no matter what. Now as you work yourself back around to the bind off edge, then the same formula applies. I'm just going to pick up and knit Once you have picked up all of your stitches along your neckline, again, you'll use the written instructions as a guide that's going to tell you how many stitches you should pick up. If you're just a couple off, it's not a huge deal. Just make sure that you keep within an odd number, total number of stitches on your needles. Well, once you're finished with that, we're going to work in the 1x1 ribbing pattern like I've already demonstrated. So you're going to start off by knitting the first stitch and then purling the next, and so on. You'll keep doing that until the end of your row. And on your second row, you'll make sure you knit the knits and you purl the purls. You're going to want to do the same number of rows for this band as you did for the bottom band and the band over here on your sleeve. And once you finish that, we'll do the same bind off that I demonstrated with the sleeve. Okay, so that's where you're going to stay within your stitch pattern. So you'll continue to knit the knits and purl the purls and bind off accordingly. So what I need for you to do at this point, since all of that stuff is review, go ahead and finish knitting your collar here. Once you finish that, then we have just a couple of other details. Obviously, you're going to need to continue and finish your other sleeve, but for the purpose of the tutorial, I'm going to keep moving so I can show you the other elements. We have our button band here, and we have a couple of pockets. Once you're finished with your neckband, it should look something like this, and we're just going to finish off the two edges here by picking up and knitting, much like we did before, with the sleeve over here. We're just going to pick up and knit along the edge, and I'm going to demonstrate the buttonhole side first, and that's because the techniques are the same for the side that we're attaching the buttons to. We're just picking up and knitting, and we're working in that 1x1 rib. So I'm going to demonstrate just one side here with the buttonholes, and then I'll have you pick up and knit along the side where you're going to attach the buttons. Now, the side that you work this on is going to be dependent on whether this is for a boy or for a girl, and you can find instructions for that in your written instructions. I am working this for a little girl, so I'm going to work my buttonhole edge right here along the left side if you're looking at it, right side for the person who's wearing the sweater. The number of stitches that you're going to pick up and knit along your edges are dependent on the size that you're creating, of course, and I am going to just pick up and knit 57 is the number that I'm looking for. And so this picking up and knitting technique is just the same. I just loop that around. And then pull it through the stitch. Once you get to the section of garter stitch, you'll just want to work one in the side and just keep track of your total number. You want to make sure you hit that number for these two bands because it's going to give us instructions for the buttonholes, and we need to be able to follow them to a T. So we want to make sure that we have our numbers the same as what's indicated in the pattern. And once you have picked up all your stitches along the buttonhole side of your band, then you're going to work in your 1x1 ribbing pattern until you just have 2 rows. So you just work the first 2 rows, and then we'll come back and I'll demonstrate how to work those buttonholes. Once you have 2 rows worked in your 1x1 rib, before we can make the buttonholes, we have to mark where they're going to go. So we're going to need 5 stitch markers and a tape measure. And what you'll do is measure from the very top down 1/2 inch, and you'll place a marker there. And then you'll do the same thing on the bottom edge. And then what we'll do is we'll evenly space these 3. So my total measurement from one marker to the one down at the bottom is about 9 inches. So I'm going to place my next stitch marker right at about the 4.5. And then I'll measure from the second to the bottom. It's about 4.5 inches, so we'll go with about 2.25. Okay, once you have those marked, then we are ready to knit our third row of the button band. Now, making the buttonholes is probably a little bit easier than you might think. We're going to work in pattern until we reach our first stitch marker. And once you get to your stitch marker, then we're going to yarn over. So you'll just want to place a wrap on your needle. So just like I did here, just grab that, and you're going to have to hold on to it with your finger. And then the next thing we need to do is knit 2 together. And the reason we have to do that is because the yarn over is adding an extra stitch to our stitch count. So we have to counteract that by knitting 2 together. And so the yarn over, you can see, creates a little bit of a hole, and that's going to be the buttonhole. So then we'll just continue working in pattern until we reach the next one, and you'll just repeat that until you get to the end of the row. Once you have your buttonhole row finished, then I recommend you do one more row working in your 1x1 rib and then doing your bind off row. So that's what I need for you to do at this point now. You'll just continue working in your pattern, and when you get to the yarn overs, you're just going to treat it as any other stitch and just knit it like normal. So here's my yarn over right here. So let me knit up to that point. And here is my yarn over. I'm just going to insert my needle right into it and knit it just like normal. And then just continue in your pattern. Once you've finished up your buttonhole band, then you can see the little holes there, and that's exactly how you want it to look. So we just have a couple more things left to do. I need you to pick up and knit your band along this side. The number of stitches you're going to pick up is going to be indicated in the pattern. You want it to be the same, obviously, as what you have over here. You're going to work in that 1x1 rib for the same number of rows that you worked this. So we actually worked 4 rows for this side over here because we had those buttonholes. So you're going to want to do 4 rows on this side as well. If you haven't already done so, you'll want to knit your other sleeve. And the last little bit that we'll have to do is knit the pockets and sew them on. So let's talk about those pockets real quick. What you'll also need to do at this point is knit your pockets. Of course, you're going to need 2, one that we can sew on each side. And we're going to cast on and just work a little square of garter stitch. And the number of stitches you're going to cast on is in your pattern. So for the first 2 sizes, you're going to cast on 15. And for the larger 2 sizes, you're going to cast on 17. And you're going to knit evenly in garter stitch. So that means you're going to knit every stitch for every row until you have 30 rows. And then you're going to bind off. And those are going to be your 2 pockets that we're going to sew on. Now, since we've already covered casting on, knitting and garter stitch, and binding off, I'm just going to have you go ahead and knit those 2 little squares, and in the next part of the demonstration I will show you how to sew those on. We'll also cover how to weave in your ends, and at that point our sweaters are basically finished. So what you see here is one of the little pockets that we are making for our sweater. And I'm going to use this as a demonstration for how to weave in our ends. We have tons of ends to weave in on our sweater. And since we're weaving it in primarily all in garter stitch, I'm going to use this little pocket here as an example of how I like to weave in my ends. So here I have, this is my little bind off spot right here, and I just like to work it to the back side of the work by just simply pulling it through. And I pay close attention to these little lumps right here. So they kind of go up and down, and I like to go down and then back up and down and back up. And what this does is it takes the end and it conceals it within the pattern. So you really can't see the tail as you're weaving it in, and you'll just go as far as you can. And once you feel good about its security, then you can just simply trim it off and start on the next one. So I'm going to weave in this last tail for the pocket, and then I'm going to show you how to sew it together. Well, there aren't a lot of instructions on how and where to stitch the pockets together. So what I'm going to do here is just eyeball it. Just put it in the place where I feel like it looks best. I'm just going to take notice of how many ridges I have between the pocket and the ribbed edging, and just try to match that up with this side over here. And once I find a position that I'm happy with, then I'm just going to take one of my locking stitch markers and secure it. And then you'll just take a scrap piece of yarn and thread that on your darning needle. Now the idea here is to sew this on, but do so that we're kind of pushing this raw edge underneath. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick one of these little stitches right here. So I'm going to use this one right here and thread my darning needle through that. And then I just want to tuck it under slightly and attach that to the cardigan. And then I'm just going to continue that, then stitch once again into the pocket and down into the sweater. Now what I'm doing now that I am down to the bottom here and I'm working along with the stitches here, I'm just going under one of the stitches that's right in front of my cast on edge. So pull that through and then work on the sweater. Just catch one of your stitches under there. And when you do that, it sort of tucks it under just like this, and it helps to conceal the raw edge. Now once you finish sewing on your pocket, then you can simply just take your tail that you are working with, poke it in through the inside, and then just weave it in along the back side of the sweater. Now before we wrap things up, I do have just one more tip to give you. Of course, we need to finish working everything. I still have a sleeve to do and another pocket to make, and I will sew those and attach those just as we've covered here in the video, so you'll need to do the same. My biggest tip is that you block your sweater once you're finished. Now, if blocking is a new technique to you, it's definitely something worth exploring because nobody's knitting is perfect, especially when it first comes off the needles. As you can see, that things are a little wobbly. I've got wobbly edges. Well, blocking is going to fix a lot of that. It's going to make your sweater look so much more professional and so much cleaner. What you'll need to do to block, it's a little bit more difficult when you're doing an item of clothing because, it has shape to it. What I plan on doing is blocking it sections at a time. So I will just turn it in this way, and I really want to block out this band so that it's nice and straight. You'll just take some lukewarm tap water, and you'll just saturate the entire thing, and you're going to pin it down to your blocking board in the shape that you want it to stay in. That, I promise you, is going to be worth the effort. You'll let it dry overnight, and then your sweater will almost look perfect. It'll remain in that shape that you pinned it to, and that's why I just think that it's such a great idea for everybody to block a finished knitted project. Well, on behalf of B.Hooked Knitting as well as redheart.com, I've had so much fun teaching you how to make this sweater. I hope yours are turning out beautifully, and I hope you'll share those with me on social media. You can post pictures to my Facebook page at B.Hooked Knitting, and I'm also on Instagram at B.Hooked Knitting. So I love looking at your work. If you have any questions whatsoever, I'm here for you. So please leave your comments either on the post at B.Hooked Knitting, the website, or below in the comments section for this video. I'll do my best to answer as many questions as possible. Thank you so much, and I will see you in the next tutorial at B.Hooked Knitting.